Hello out there, all you beautiful internet people. Today is something a little bit different. Haven't done a book review in a while, and having recently finished Dune by Frank Herbert, this copy here is extremely waterlogged because I happened to take it up to Boulder with my water bottle in the same backpack, and I didn't think to put this in a plastic bag, but it's still readable. Having recently finished Dune, I'd like to give my thoughts on it, give my kind of opinion on it. This took me pretty long to read, actually, because I've had a lot of work to do, but I've been reading it on my spare time, on the bus, whenever I don't have anything better to do, etc. And I'd like to address some of the interesting arguments that are brought up against Dune, in particular that Dune is racist. Because I think the way that a book like Dune is interpreted and read and seen by a lot of generations kind of speaks to the overarching attitude of humanity in any given period. And I think there's a lot to Dune to discuss, so let's get into it.
The most precious substance in the universe is the spice melange. The spice melange. The spice melange. The spice expands consciousness. The spice is right.
I have no idea actually why Dune is regarded by some as being racist. Anytime someone tries to explain how Dune is racist, I realize more and more that what I'm listening to is an extremely flawed reading of the text as it exists. I do think it is possible to just kind of read an entire book or watch an entire movie, and its message doesn't really wear off on you, and you only interpret it in the most surface level fashion possible. I think part of the problem is that a lot of people's exposure to science fiction is just through an extremely basic, bland crap story like I have no mouth and I must scream, which really doesn't have any subtext, but people just read it because it's popular and huge, and everyone's like, this is the best Harlan Ellison story, this is the greatest thing he ever wrote. No kidding, I've actually run into people who were surprised and amazed that he ever wrote anything else. They just thought his entire bibliography was I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, maybe A Boy and His Dog, both of which are his two worst works, like hands down. Dune is the type of book that requires a lot of thought and contemplation and a real introspection, not only for the characters in the book, but for yourself. Reading Dune, if you approach it with an open mind, is a kind of transformative process. I would argue that reading Dune will help you become a more well-rounded person. A lot better than reading the Bible or the Quran or something like that would, because Dune is written by Frank Herbert, who I think is a smarter guy than Jesus. The argument against Dune and that Dune is racist typically goes like this. Frank Herbert is an old white Christian man, and his depictions of Islam via the Fremen is racist and insensitive. And furthermore, Paul Atreides' portrayal as a bold hero, a kind of prophetic figure, a messianic figure, so to speak, is offensive because he's a white man going into Muslim country and he conquers the Muslims and becomes their king, and that's racist and bad. I can pick apart this argument on every single level. First and foremost, from what I've read, the sources on this are scant, but from what I've read, Frank Herbert was not a Christian. He was born Catholic, he can't help that, but he did convert to Zen Buddhism, which I, as an atheist, actually respect and admire him for. Certain sources say that he was an atheist. Maybe he took Zen Buddhism as a philosophy, but religiously was an atheist. I don't know. One thing is for certain, however, Frank Herbert was absolutely not a fucking Christian. This is a really weird rumor to just spout baselessly, or to assume in any way that the kind of neo-feudal space medieval society depicted in Dune is something that Frank Herbert would directly endorse. Being an American, I imagine Frank Herbert would be much more into democracy, and rightly so. The reader and Frank Herbert would probably interpret the Landsrat and the imperial houses and all this stuff as a bizarre regression given that science fiction typically depicts humanity's progression as not going back to kings and queens and medieval shit, but it's just something that Frank Herbert added in to make his book different. At the time that Dune was written, the most popular science fiction series was Asimov's Foundation series, which is all about robotics and technology and the like. What Dune does differently is that it presents a universe set so far after all that. In fact, I think like Dune and Foundations could theoretically exist in the same universe, as is basically referenced like in the first couple chapters, that thousands of years prior to Dune, there was a point when humanity relied way too much excessively on computers and robots to do all their work for them. Dune takes an entirely different direction. Dune is about a world populated by people. It's about human insight and the human experience and the human condition, projected far, far into the future. At the same time, wanting to be different, Frank Herbert imposes a weird neo-feudal, medieval, European-ish type society onto Dune. There are two other aspects that make Dune extremely interesting and different from other sci-fi pieces. First off, as I said, there are no robots. There is no artificial life in the world of Dune. All life is organic, and they do have machinery, they do have simple computers to do extremely simple tasks, but artificial intelligence is strictly forbidden, and anyone who uses it is severely punished. This is an interesting limitation that opens the door to new forms of storytelling that you couldn't get with something like Isaac Asimov's Foundations. The other really interesting aspect of Dune, the Dune universe, is that there are no aliens. Humans are the only species in the known universe. At the same time, humans have evolved on different planets like Caladan and Giedi Prime and Ix, to the extent that some of them are barely even recognizable as human anymore. They've gotten all flabby, or they've gotten really thin, or they've evolved different appendages and brand new organs and shit. So some of them aren't even really human as you or I would recognize it. They've mutated and deformed and sprouted new things. And Frank Herbert presents this as an interesting thought experiment. What if there was a universe where there really aren't any aliens? Now, for all we know, in the Dune universe there could be aliens, but humans never run into them, which is actually pretty fucking realistic, because let's suppose that the aliens are just so fucking far away that, like, we never run into them. That's a perfectly feasible scenario, but it's yet another fascinating limitation that Frank Herbert imposes on the Dune universe. Now, you might be saying, well, Nick, what about the sandworms? But for all we know, the sandworms are just extremely long descendants of some kind of Earth species worm that happened to find its way off Earth and evolved on Arrakis. Earthworms aren't like humanoid level life forms. They don't really have a consciousness that deep. And for all we know, they're not technically aliens. They could have just come from Earth with the rest of humanity. At the same time, sandworms are some of the coolest fucking things in any science fiction book ever. I personally have always had a deep-seated fascination with worms, particularly earthworms, so to see them in a giant form where you can ride them is like, holy shit, this is some of the coolest fucking shit I've ever read. This is fucking awesome. These giant fucking worms that just slither around and move about and fucking hills of sand. Holy shit, I fucking love the sandworms. They're fucking awesome. Point being, Frank Herbert, as far as we know, was not a Christian, at least not in the commonly understood sense. Dune is, for all intents and purposes, pretty much a book about religion, and the way that religion influences people, and the way that people can be religiously indoctrinated and manipulated. But as a fervent atheist who dislikes most religions across the board, I would argue that Dune is in strong condemnation of religious indoctrination and zealotry. It is not religious propaganda, nor does it even remotely endorse the religion of Christianity in particular over Islam. One thing that should be mentioned here is that in the universe of Dune, Christianity and Islam in the forms they exist are so far removed from modern day contemporary Christianity and Islam that a current day Christian or a current day Muslim would have an extremely difficult time recognizing their respective faiths in the Dune universe. At the same time, I think it's extremely reductive to just argue, oh, the people from Caladan are white people, and the people from Arrakis are brown people. Because in the Dune universe, race as we currently know it, and Frank Herbert was obviously aware of this, that race is a social construct. Race as we currently know in the Dune universe simply does not exist. Every planet and every house and every culture has a wide range, a massive blend of white and brown in all races, and the races we currently have on Earth don't even fucking apply anymore because humans have basically become entirely separate species on all their different worlds, like Yeti, Prime, and Arrakis and everything. So there are new races and new groups of people, and there's been so much race mixing that House Atreides is not just like white people. In the book, they're described as olive-skinned, so kind of Mediterranean-ish, but there's absolutely no way they're just like pure white people like you'd see down in Texas or something. They're like a diverse family that's existed for thousands of millennia and is not like just a stand-in for white people or Christians. By that same token, the Fremen are not just a replacement term for current day Muslims. Fremen culture is so fucking different from current day Islamic culture, and if I recall reading Dune, I don't think Jesus or Muhammad are really mentioned once. The only holy text we see in the entirety of the first Dune book, which I do plan on reading the sequels eventually because they sound dope as fuck, but I'm just going off the first book here. The only holy text we really hear about is the Orange Catholic Bible. But obviously this is a future type book set in a world that's thousands of years removed from our own. So it's really stupid to assume that the Orange Catholic Bible has anything to do with real-world Catholicism, or that it's like just the King James Bible with a few verses changes. To the contrary, the world of Dune seems to have an extreme Islamic influence that's pervasive throughout most of the planets, to the extent that, from some sources I've heard, the Orange Catholic Bible is more close to the Quran than it is to the actual Bible. Now, obviously, I do think it's important to mention here that the assumed narrative that a lot of these critics of Dune seem to be going off of, that Paul Atreides is a white colonizer coming to a Muslim planet who takes advantage of the Muslim people and forces them to do his bidding, all of that is portrayed, for the most part, in a negative light. And Paul Atreides is not a hero in the traditional sense. Rather, he's a sort of brooding, pathetic, extremely flawed anti-hero at best. Dune is about exploring themes of political control. The Harkonnens are patently evil, but the Atreides are not god beings. They're not perfect. They're not entirely great. Leto Atreides does away with the old custom where Fremen drink from the excess of dish rags, but at the same time he's only doing this as a gesture to present himself as the savior of the Fremen to accumulate power for himself. Dune is about a society where people backstab and cheat and swindle each other non-stop. It's a universe of assassins, so to speak. People try and poison each other. People try and shoot each other just to take over a couple acres of land or some wealth or some shit. It's an extremely materialistic, toxic landscape that Dune presents here. And in that regard, I'd say that Dune is a really fucking woke-ass book. Like, quite possibly one of the most woke books you'll ever read. It's about how people will just screw each other over for even the most minute gains, and they'll do this at the expense of the people over which they rule. The Fremen get really the short end of the stick, whether it's Leto ruling them, whether it's Paul ruling them. It's all a bunch of bullshit. And Frank Herbert completely recognizes this. That's the point of the fucking book. To say that Dune is in favor of religious messiahs is kind of like saying that Blade Runner is in favor of law enforcement. To the contrary, these are science fiction works which actively deconstruct and critique these societal issues. The complaint that Fremen are just stand-ins for Muslims with no cultural specificity or unique attributes reminds me a lot of the tired old complaint that Jar Jar Binks is a racist depiction of a Rastafarian, even though Gungans aren't Rastafarians and Jar Jar Binks is a fish alien and he's played by a black guy. While science fiction books like Dune are meant to function in some capacity as analogies, they're also meant to create new characters and worlds that are interesting and that simply couldn't exist here on Earth. Scenarios and situations which can only exist in the realm of the mind. You can say that Jar Jar Binks is a Rastafarian, or that Yoda is the Buddha, or that Boba Fett is Clint Eastwood, or that Palpatine is Hitler, but at the same time, these are new characters with changes made to them so that they're not just copies of the old ones. Clint Eastwood and Boba Fett are fundamentally different characters with somewhat different attributes. I would imagine that Boba Fett's childhood as a clone raised on Kamino by his surrogate father Jango Fett would influence him a little differently from Clint Eastwood as the man with no name in Sergio Leone's Dollar Trilogy. The point I mean to make here is that it's extremely reductive when dealing with science fiction to just assume that the Jedi Order is exactly like a Buddhist temple or whatever. It probably has different rules and regulations. By that same token, it's extremely reductive to assume that the Empire in Star Wars functions just like Nazi Germany, because they are fascist, but there are different forms of fascism and different forms of fascist government, and they'll all have their own rules and intricacies and points. With Dune, it makes even less sense because Dune is by default an extremely bleak, nihilistic work. Unlike Star Wars, which I would argue is actually a much more spiritual series in that there is actually supernatural phenomena, there's ghosts, there's the Force, there's fate and stuff like that, and Anakin is destined to be the chosen one. There's this prophecy, he's supposed to bring balance to the Force, there's all this spiritual shit, all this namby-pamby bullshit. Dune presents a world where the strings are pulled aside and we get an insight into how religious fanaticism takes hold among a group of people who have been indoctrinated and given propaganda without their even realizing it. The Fremen are, in essence, being manipulated and pulled along and goaded by Jessica and Paul. And the Bene Gesserit have spent millennia on Arrakis just filling the heads of the Fremen with all this bullshit that's not even their own belief system. They just stuff Reverend Mothers and shit into the Fremen belief system with zero regard for how the Fremen feel or whether or not the Fremen can function independently as a native people. Dune is about that. Dune is about colonization and imperialism and religious fanaticism from the point of view of the religious messiah, which is an interesting point to take. But I think Dune condemns this sort of behavior in a really obvious, blatant way. Unlike in Star Wars, where there's the dark and light side, and Luke Skywalker is a pretty boring hero when you get right down to it, who's just the complete good guy, and he never really makes a mistake. He's tempted to the dark side, but that's never going to happen. He kills the Emperor, saves Darth Vader, they reconcile, and then there's the good and dark side, and it's really clear-cut who's on the light side, and who's on the dark side, and who's a Jedi, and who's a Sith. Dune doesn't have any of that. Dune doesn't exist in a morally simplistic universe like that, where you can say, oh yeah, you're good and they're evil. It's a story about human error. Dune is actually set in like a godless universe, and I do think Dune in many ways attempts to convey also the wonder of religion, the excitement of religious fervor, the importance of having spiritual connections. And obviously Dune, presenting this kind of neo-feudal religious society, is going to deal with the topic a lot more, and not all its depictions of religion are inherently negative. Fremen religion, where the worms are worshipped as like basically deities and the worms are given extra special treatment, I think is kind of nice. It's kind of touching. It's kind of cute. It also attempts in many ways to capture the thrill of what becoming a messiah would be like. To be this flawless Übermensch who can do no wrong and getting victories over your opponents. But at the same time, the sequels are what document Paul's descent into depravity and moral bankruptcy. The bloody jihad that Paul instigates winds up with the death of 61 billion people, which is pretty fucking insane if you think about it, and I really doubt Frank Herbert is trying to justify that in any way. I think it's pretty morally reprehensible behavior when you get right down to it. Paul Atreides is a bloody despot. But like I said, Dune also attempts to kind of capture Paul at his height at the end of the first Dune book as the hero of the Fremen, the uniter of the people, the chief of Arrakis. It's a lot like Napoleon. You know, Napoleon has his high and then he has his low. He rises and then he falls. This is typically the pattern we see with all manner of tyrants and dictators and the like. They feel good when they're on the rise. They feel like they're really doing something important and monumental. But Paul ends his days as a wandering blind man in the desert. At the same time, as I said, given that the world of Dune, all worlds in Dune in fact, contain pretty Islamic influences and not really any like humanist or modern or transcendentalist or philosophical influences. There aren't really any great thinkers in the Dune universe. Humanity is kind of past that phase. I do think it's important to note that one's assumption that Dune is inherently just a book about a Christian guy converting a bunch of Muslim guys and that being extremely racist fails to recognize that Islam is also a religion which is just about conquering land and converting as many people as possible, and it's conquered as much land and killed about as many people as Christianity has. If we're being realistic, Islam and Christianity are the two major religions currently on Earth. Islam has destroyed and decimated plenty of indigenous religions. The animism of North Africa, the traditions and beliefs of Egypt. The Muslims and Christians were equally bloody during the Crusades and committed just as many atrocities against each other. Both parties, I would argue, during the Crusades were equally at fault. Religious fanaticism is not good no matter who it comes from, and I would argue that Islam is full of as many lousy ideas as Christianity. As an atheist, I only believe in objective reality, as it exists. I think to paint Islam as some kind of underdog or some kind of persecuted sect when it's literally the world's second largest religion is kind of like favoring Pepsi over Coca-Cola and going on about how Pepsi's the underdog and Pepsi has it so rough because Coca-Cola exists. It's like, they're both fucking giant. Neither of them really has a disadvantage. Now compare that to Zen Buddhism, Frank Herbert's chosen religion, which by contrast is a much more introspective, ideologically rich, self-aware method of belief. Zen Buddhism's the shit, but for whatever reason, a lot of contemporary people just look at one photo of Frank Herbert, go, oh yeah, this guy was probably a Christian, and he's being racist towards Muslims. Even though, from reading Dune, you can tell that Frank Herbert had a pretty deep-seated respect and admiration for Islamic culture, and if Dune hadn't been written, most people these days wouldn't even know what Islam is. Dune might be some people's first introduction to Islam as a belief system. It can actually cultivate tolerance between Christians and Muslims to see themselves both represented in an epic science fiction universe to which I, a jaded atheist, can equally relate, which is a really impressive feat that Frank Herbert has pulled off here. Because Dune is not disrespectful to religion, it points out the flaws of religious extremism and religious indoctrination, but at the end of the day, it is far from anywhere close to a bigoted book that attacks religion or anything. Dune gives more credence to religion than I ever would. I mean, if I were to write a sci-fi story, there wouldn't be any religion in it, because I don't even see how humanity expects to colonize space while we're still believing in angels and gods and all this fake shit. But Dune is different in that it does depict that. It depicts the impossible. It depicts a neo-feudal world where everyone is still capitalist and greedy and just as flawed and broken as they are here on Earth, but in space, and set thousands of years in the future. And you kind of wonder while reading Dune, wait, how the fuck did we progress this far while we still have all the exact same flaws and we're still susceptible to charismatic leaders like Paul Atreides, and we're still willing to kill 61 billion people in a bloody extremist jihad? Dune is the type of book that makes you ask questions like that if you look at it beyond a surface level. And I, for one, think it's extremely depressing that people don't tend to think of it beyond a surface level. And a lot of people I've spoken to say, well, you know, Frank Herbert was an old white racist piece of shit, but I still like Dune. I'm not even sure how this is compatible. It's like, you want to have your cake and eat it too. You want to enjoy this book that's like a great, timeless, extremely prescient, self-aware book, and Frank Herbert was actually like not a racist and not a homophobe and not a problematic author in any way, shape, or form. But at the same time, you want to paint him as such. It's like, if you don't like Frank Herbert and you legitimately think that the depiction of the Fremen in Dune is racist somehow, then why read it and why praise it in any capacity if it's this giant racist, pro-imperialist type book? You can't really give Dune credit as a good book if at the same time you're underestimating Frank Herbert's intelligence and his ability to predict things like religious extremism and his ability to notice societal trends. That's kind of what Dune is all about. It's about politics and the progression of time and lineage and the like. Primarily, Dune isn't even about religion. Its central theme, its main thing, its spiritual central pillar, so to speak, is ecology. Pardo Kynes and Liet Kynes are inserts of Frank Herbert and his father, and I think that's really interesting when you get right down to it, that the main character of Dune isn't even Paul Atreides, it's Liet Kynes. I think the reason a lot of people approach Dune this way, saying that it is outdated or that it's boring or that Frank Herbert is old and white and racist, is because Dune is popular now. Dune has finally gone from being a niche, underground, obscure science fiction thing that never really got a great movie adaptation to now the Denis Villeneuve thing being a huge financial success. Everyone likes it. Everyone has a new science fiction universe that they can enjoy and explore and check out. And that's something extremely cool and extremely awesome. And Dune is like a breath of fresh air, especially for science fiction movies, which for a decade straight have been dominated by Marvel and the shitty new Star Wars trilogy. So I imagine a lot of people enjoy being contrarians about Dune and being like, this is an imperialist story. This story is fucking racist and lame, and Frank Herbert was an old white piece of shit. I bet there were people who were equally annoying when Star Wars first came out in 1977 going, George Lucas is an old piece of shit. What a bastard. What a shitty bastard to bring us this expansive sci-fi universe. And also, it's racist. Heck, when you think about it, people like that actually do exist. I think this kind of approach to fiction is not only extremely reductive, it's just very toxic and it's an extremely bad reading. And if someone tells me that Dune is like pro-imperialism or pro-religious fanaticism, I'll tell them that that's an extremely bad reading and that there are just some ways to interpret art that's just like fundamentally flawed, that's not what it's about. Like if I watched Blade Runner and concluded that it was about the perfect SpaghettiOs recipe, someone would have every right to say, no, that's not what it's about, Nick. It's about a lot of things, but it just happens not to be about that. I do think this is a bad reading, but I think first and foremost this is a bad reading created by the current plague of endemic pervasive illiteracy that America is going through, where the average kid is more likely to play 5 hours of fucking Fortnite than to pick up a great book like Dune. And where science fiction like Dune is not actively incorporated into the public school curriculum, instead we just get shit like To Kill a Mockingbird and Catcher in the Rye and boring shit like that, because America tends to view science fiction as inferior, pulpy trash. And they're like, let's get J.D. Salinger in there. But Dune is a better fucking book than The Catcher in the Rye, and I have complete confidence that if more people read Dune, they'd be more well informed about politics, religion, a lot of other philosophical ideas like that, and there would be a lot less stupid people claiming that Dune is racist somehow, because, like, it's not. And if you read Dune, you'd know that it's not. This is not in any way an attack on the woke crowd or SJWs or whatever. I don't believe any of that shit exists. There are just some bad perspectives that certain people hold that I'm sure people will realize are pretty flawed if they actually bother to read the Dune sequels, which actively go out of their way to stress just like how flawed a character Paul Atreides is. But a lot of people don't read those books, and they just read the first one and watch the movies, and the movies always just adapt the first one, so you don't really get the depth and nuance and complexity that Frank Herbert works into the sequels, which are meant to be read as one single unit along with Dune, and together form one of the best, like, well-planned series ever written, which is extremely cohesive and follows logically from the first book.
Editing Nick here. I just wanted to pop in and make a kind of interesting point, which is that only reading the first Dune book and not reading the sequels is like only watching The Phantom Menace and not watching Attack of the Clones or Revenge of the Sith and coming away with the impression that Anakin is a hero instead of a deeply flawed character who tragically falls to the dark side. It's kind of like that. Both Paul and Anakin are flawed characters in that regard, with like a lot of negative attributes, and I think that type of character writing is very interesting. But yeah, just reading the first Dune book is like just watching The Phantom Menace, which The Phantom Menace isn't a bad movie, but it works well in context and in conjunction with Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, the same way that to fully understand Dune, you also have to read Children of Dune and Dune Messiah and Heretics of Dune and all that. Just a little comparison for you there. Anyway, back to the video.
I guess the point I mean to make with this video is not that, you know, the woke mob is canceling Dune, Dune is over party, or anything like that, because Dune is actually, like, the most woke, progressive, extremely smart, captivating, prescient, self-aware, well-written, educated, informed series ever made. There is basically nothing you can say about Dune that it's, like, bad. It's actually, like, really fucking smart and good, and I find it pretty laughable that people these days think that they have a better handle on societal issues than, like, Frank Herbert, who, from everything I've read, was an absolute fucking genius. You kind of have to be to make a world this layered and dense. Now, the point I mean to make is that if you do think Dune is racist, maybe you should just stop engaging with all fiction, because I, for one, prefer science fiction universes with a wide, diverse range of people of all body shapes and skin tones and colors and cultures and ethnicities. I prefer science fiction universes that are large and expansive and feature all kinds of wild concepts, and I think Dune satisfies that demand perfectly. It is an extremely diverse series of books that not only actively promotes the Islamic belief system and Islamic culture, what Frank Herbert does with Dune is essentially comfort the reader that in the future religion will survive, albeit in an extremely transformed, unrecognizable way. There are a lot of other potential criticisms that you could probably make against Dune. You could probably say that Dune is homophobic because Peter de Vries is a bad guy and he's described as being effeminate, even though that doesn't necessarily mean he's gay, and his main character flaw is being a fucking psychopath, not being effeminate. Likewise, you could say that Baron Harkonnen is a fat-phobic figure, and that it's offensive to have an evil character who's fat and gluttonous, even though, like, his main character trait, again, his main problem that Frank Herbert presents as being the problem is not that Baron Harkonnen is fat. That's not really presented as, like, the main issue. The main issue is that, again, he's a fucking psychopathic murderer, a merciless dictator who just takes over planets for his own personal gain with zero thought for the millions of people who live on them. You could also probably make the argument that Baron Harkonnen is homophobic because he's also gay, except the problem that Frank Herbert kind of points out is not that Baron Harkonnen is gay, but rather that he's a gay pedophile, which is a problem. You know, there are a lot of stupid criticisms that could be lobbed against Dune, but I don't think any of them really work. You could say that Dr. Wellington Yue is an offensive Asian character, even though in the new Dune movie he's played by an Asian guy, and he's an extremely rich, layered, complex, interesting character whose race is not even remotely a factor in how he performs as a character within the parameters of the story. And as I said before, race as we currently understand it does not even really exist in the Dune universe, so Yue isn't even Asian. He doesn't even know what Asia is because humanity doesn't live on Earth anymore. Ultimately, if you don't have characters with a wide, diverse, interesting array of attributes and characteristics, all you end up with is just a science fiction story with a bunch of boring white people doing boring shit and facing zero adversity and facing zero cultural interaction, and that's a really fucking boring story. So I, for one, am actually pretty glad that Dune has, like, Asian characters and black characters and shit, and it feels like an extremely well-developed, diverse, interesting universe. This book does not fucking age, and any attempts to make it age just come off as extremely futile. I guess I'd like to end this video with an interesting point, which is that science fiction authors, more than any other genre really, tend to be subject to all kinds of controversies. And there are some controversies that a science fiction author can engage in that I'm really not willing to forgive them on. I've said this in the past, but I generally don't like supporting art made by people who seem like scumbags. So I don't. I stopped reading H.P. Lovecraft because H.P. Lovecraft actually is a giant fucking racist. It's proven that he was a giant fucking racist. And yet a lot of people still tend to make excuses for him, or say that he was gay or something, which he absolutely fucking wasn't. He was just some kind of fucking backwards racist troglodyte. Isaac Asimov, the author of the aforementioned Foundations trilogy, was apparently known for groping women at parties. And I can't endorse that. I'm not going to read the Foundations trilogy because, you know, I don't endorse the groping of random women at parties. I think that's a scumbag thing to do. I think Isaac Asimov was a little too fucking horny for his own good. Arthur C. Clarke, author of a lot of beloved science fiction classics such as 2001: A Space Odyssey and the short story that inspired it, The Sentinel, according to a recent video by film analyst and YouTuber Rob Ager, was actually a pedophile who molested tons of young boys in Sri Lanka for like decades on end with nobody interfering and nobody noticing. That's really bizarre to consider, but it just goes to show that a lot of these figures, in the science fiction sphere anyway, have like extremely dark and messed up and kind of fucked histories that we just tend to kind of ignore for the sake of convenience. But Frank Herbert, from everything I've seen, is the least problematic science fiction author. He was well educated, grounded, had a good fucking head on his shoulders, and knew what the fuck he was talking about. He was a normal guy with a normal marriage and normal kids who lived a pretty normal life from everything I can gather. He wasn't a racist, he wasn't a homophobe, he wasn't a transphobe, he wasn't anything other than just an average guy who happened to have like an extremely cool-ass universe going on in his head. And he was kind of a fucking genius. From everything I can tell, there was absolutely nothing wrong with this guy. And any attempt to paint him as like some malevolent force or some like racist or a Christian, which again, he wasn't. He was born into a Catholic family, which you can't control, and then he converted to Zen Buddhism. Any attempt to paint Frank Herbert as anything less than just an absolute science fiction mad lad, just an absolute fucking genius, just a figure to be revered as one of the greatest writers of all time, it comes off as very try-hard and forced, and like you're just trying to come up with problems even where like they don't exist. Because like Dune is not a problematic book. It's the opposite of a problematic book. It's like an extremely progressive, woke, forward-thinking, well-intentioned book that bestows a lot of wisdom on people who actually take the time to pick it up and read it. And it's not fucking boring. It's extremely fucking exciting. People these days do tend to have a lot of hubris when judging figures of the past and going, oh, this guy was racist, this guy was sexist. And in most cases, it is applicable. Most people in the past were probably not up to speed on the standards of today, but there are certain figures like Frank Herbert or Malcolm X or whoever who you can say were probably intellectual enough, well-informed enough that they probably had a pretty good grasp on societal issues and the ways that people manipulate each other into hating each other for political power and gain, and all of this. It's not a very difficult thing to wrap your head around, but I do think it's funny when we morally superior Gen Zers, we truth brigaders, those of us who denounce figures like Frank Herbert or Malcolm X or whatever as being old and stodgy and out of date and stupid. One day we'll be that, and everyone will be pointing at us and going, you were racist, Nick, you fucking piece of shit. You old racist, you fucking bastard, you homophobic piece of shit. Ultimately, I think that's just a small, very small minority of the average, reading demographic or whatever. I don't think it's as common as someone like Ben Shapiro would have you believe, but what the heck, I just figured it was worth making it for Dune in particular. Making an entire video kind of debunking the claims that Dune is racist, because that's got to be one of the most weird, backwards, just ass-wrong takes about any book that maybe I've ever heard. It's just completely baseless and stupid, and so far from what Dune is that it makes me wonder if people even bother to actually engage with this text in any meaningful capacity. But yeah, Dune's the shit. After reading it, I give it what do I give it? 10 out of 10 stars. This is a perfect fucking book, one of the best books ever written. You should read this book, and it will inspire you, and it will transform you. It's going to give you the water of life. It's going to give you that spiritual experience, and you're going to become the freaking Quisitz-Haderach after you read this shit, because it's fucking awesome. And I can't really emphasize enough just how great Dune is. I can tell the difference between propaganda like L. Ron Hubbard's Scientology shit, which is some of the worst written sci-fi ever made, and stuff like Dune. One fact that I didn't know about Frank Herbert before I made this video was that a lot of people actually wanted to start a Dune-themed cult and revere Frank Herbert as their leader, which is an equally stupid reading of the text, because Dune is all about the fallibility of charismatic leaders and how they can go astray. And Frank Herbert obviously said, no thanks, I don't want to be your leader. I don't want to tell you what to think, and I don't want to tell you what to do, and I don't want to make up your mind for you. So, at the end of the day, it's absolutely within your rights to accuse Frank Herbert of being a disgusting old racist who is wrong and stupid and offensive, because that's what Frank Herbert would have wanted you to do, because Dune encourages freedom of thought and freedom of expression and a diversity of opinions. Even if you're fundamentally wrong, it's what Frank Herbert would have wanted. So go ahead and say Dune is racist, and you're wrong, but you can say that if you really want to, for whatever reason. I don't know.